Excellent. We're live. We're live. Hey, Brian.
Hey, buddy. Good talking to you.
Excellent talking to you. Yeah, I'll introduce you in a second, but let me just say for everybody, we're trying something different this time. Reed's the brains behind the operation. He's always comes up with cool stuff. So what topic do you most want to hear Brian and Peter talk about? So you can either scan the QR code there or join at menti.com and 35175552, and it's free. So education, cosmology, science versus religion. So we can watch people vote as this comes in. I find this absolutely fascinating, and so I'll just defer to what people want to talk about. So how you doing? How's the weather down there?
Oh, it's finally gotten hot and spicy. You know, it was very much marine layer summer, fake summer.
Oh yeah.
Now it's a true San Diego summer. So yeah, hoping to hit the beach later on and get my surf on. Yeah,
good for you. Do you ever see Jamie Ian Swiss lives in San Diego? He's a buddy of mine. Do you know who he is? Do you ever see him, the famous magician?
No, I don't. No, I'd like to meet him.
Yeah, he's good. He's an uber skeptic. He's a very, very interesting guy. He writes about magic, and his magic performances are just totally mind blowing.
That's amazing.
I got to figure out how to deal with that cough. Anyway, it's really good to see you, and I'm delighted to have you on. Let me do your intro while the votes come in. I did a lot of research about you, and holy moly, you are an astonishingly accomplished man. I can't believe you're talking to me. So here's some of I couldn't even begin to put in your accomplishments. So I just condensed them. Cosmologist Brian Keating is a distinguished professor of physics at the University of California, San Diego, and associate director of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. You've authored 2 books, Losing the Nobel Prize, The Story of Cosmology, Ambition, and Perils of Science, Highest Honor, and Into the Impossible, Think Like a Nobel Prize Winner. Brian, and you host the incredibly popular podcast, Into the Impossible. And your scientific publications, papers, etc. And I find your conversations with people I just find them to be fascinating. So I'd like to thank you for that. Okay, so where are we in the voting? Science versus religion and science versus politics are dominating. Oh, science versus religion. So let me start with some softball questions here, and then we'll dig into the dirt. And I do want to say that I think it's one unfortunate thing of living in this age is people. So I consider us friends. Do you consider us friends?
I not only consider us friends, but I would trust you to watch, one of my kids who's a BJJ aficionado.
Oh, really?
He would like to challenge you to a duel. He challenged Jocko Willink to a battle. But no, in all seriousness, you were on my podcast. I can't believe it. 2 years ago, we met during here's how to date yourself. We met on Clubhouse. Okay. So that says something if people even remember what that is. We met on Clubhouse. We have mutual friends.
Yeah.
And I had you on my podcast to discuss how to have impossible conversations. My podcast is called Into the Impossible. So why not? If I had done a vote, who won that debate, if it was a debate, it was far and away you. And since then, I've found you to be a confidant. As you know, I've got some huge things coming up in my life. Won't talk about those yet, but stay tuned to both of our channels for more information. But I seek you out when I have questions, concerns, and I view you as my consigliere.
That's very kind of you. I genuinely appreciate that, Brian. Seriously, that's really. I'm verklempt. Just choked up. That's very kind of you. It means the world to me. It means a lot to me. And I think what's interesting about this is that there's this weird thing in today's age where people think they have to agree with literally everything. Everybody's all of someone's beliefs before they can have a relationship or be friends with them or something. It's a very bizarre phenomenon. So you and I have different religious beliefs, different metaphysical beliefs, which fall from that. I'd like to take a look at that. And that doesn't affect, it's just crazy to me to think that because people have different metaphysical beliefs that would somehow intrude upon a friendship of virtue. That's like, I don't even know why, even thinking that itself is a kind of ideology.
I think it's narcissism. I mean, if you think that you're incapable of being disagreed with and maintaining comedy and comity, then it's a sign of a low rate intellect, a midwit intellect. I think what distinguishes you and I, and the way that our colleagues and friends, the people we respect, and you've had on, millions of just incredible conversations, and you yourself are one of the best, kind of public intellectuals. I always say, if you had a choice, between Peter Boghossian or almost any other professor, you should have chosen him. And I really, when you left your campus previously, Portland State, that I said was a devastating day for Portland State students, and it was something they wouldn't likely recover from. And because you care about lecturing, and I hope that some of the audience will want to talk about education, because Peter, it's time we basically blow up a lot of education, the higher education. And from education at the highest levels flow all the culture wars and all the devastating nonsense
100%.
we call Narishkeit in Yiddish, just bull crap, nonsensical ideas. It all flows from academia. Everything, politics, every politician went to college, pretty much. I don't know. 100%. All journalists do, all the Twitterati do. They all go to college. So therefore, if you want to kind of stop the metastasization, we must start at that level. And I hope we'll get into that. But let's talk about science, religion. I know you guys have a clip, and we'll talk about it. Yes. Just to set the stakes, Peter, as you know, I am not a theist in the sense of my rabbi at that same level. I believe it's almost presumptuous. And as our mutual friend Jordan Peterson says, like, who the hell are you to say you believe in God? Like, oh, God needs like Peter and Brian's, whatever. Right. But I am what I consider to be a devout, practicing, card carrying agnostic. And for reasons I can get into, I believe that is the ecumenical and also economical, in the Occam's razor sense, parsimonious way for a scientist like me who studies the Big Bang, origin of the universe, etc., to maintain.
Okay, there's just so much to talk about. I'm flooded with thoughts right now. So there's the education piece, which is indispensable. We have to talk about that, because that's what you need for the functioning of civil society. You have to have that. We have to talk about colleges of education. We have to talk about ideological capture. Yep. We also need to talk about, so we're just setting the stage for what we're going to talk about. And then Reed, once the Mentimeter populates, if you could throw that up, so we'll guide the conversation that way, that would be great. Yeah. So what do we got here? Science versus. Oh, good. So we got a good smattering of things so far. Okay, cool. So the other thing that we need to talk about is so I'm just gonna jump right into it. So when I was in graduate school, I had a professor literally yell at me when I asked him why there couldn't be an infinite regress. He yelled at me, like, why I had I've talked about, to our other mutual friend Lawrence Krauss, I've talked to him about this stuff at length. So explain to me why. And I know you've said you've talked about the multiverse, and we have a clip about that. Why can't there be an infinite regress?
Well, certainly there can be. There's nothing, everything that is not forbidden is not only permissible, but is mandatory, is the saying that we employ in quantum mechanics. So the question is there sufficient reason to believe that the multiverse exists? And what becomes uncomfortable for both believers, theologically inclined believers, and non-believers, is that there is almost a conflation. There is an overlap between the tenets and postulates of those that don't believe in the multiverse and those that do, and they're diametrically opposed when it comes to theism. So here's an example. Stephen C. Meyer is one of the directors of the Discovery Institute up in Seattle.
Right.
And he's a friend. I've had him on the show, and he maintains with all his might and force that their theory of what's called cosmological inflation, which we can explain, is the spark that ignited the Big Bang that we now observe today. Concomitant with that, Lawrence Krauss, who's one of the staunchest atheists and probably wouldn't talk to Stephen. Maybe although he is the main character in Stephen's most recent book, Return of the God Hypothesis. They were supposed to have a debate. It didn't happen. There's a lot of hijinks involved. You'll find out about it if you read the book, which I blurbed as you may know. But the belief of Lawrence and Stephen are diametrically opposed when it comes to the Big Banger or lack thereof. So how can these two different things be reconciled? Well, they can't unless the underpinning of the theory is so flexible, so all-encompassing, so squishy that it admits, these completely diametric downstream conclusions to be drawn from the same theory. That's a sign of an immature, but not necessarily incompetent or incomplete theoretical framework. And so the question we have to ask is, are these part of the scientific endeavor? That great, you when you come to visit me or I come to visit you, I'm going to bring you some finger puppets. My audience knows that.
Oh, excellent.
I'm used to fingering Galileo. I've got Carl Sagan here. I've got Einstein. I've got them all. I don't have Peter. I'd love to finger you, Peter. But Galileo said our job as scientists is to measure what's measurable and make measurable what is not yet so. And so you have to ask the question. You can speculate on these matters of wordy philosophers, as Galileo used to deride philosophers, and sometimes Lawrence Krauss does as well. But at the same token, you should have sufficient reason to do that. So can you propose an experiment that would reveal the presence of the multiverse? Or can you only say we must wait, or we must use only indirect evidence? As I wrote about in Skeptic magazine for Michael Shermer, I wrote about, what if we're in a situation where the belief and credulity in a scientific field must be accepted not on logical proof, but on social proof? That's a scary situation.
Okay, so again, I have so much to talk to you about. Okay, so let's see if we can find points of agreement here.
Yeah.
Can we agree that one cannot reason one's way to the answer to the question of if there can be an infinite regress? Can we agree that you would need empirical evidence? Forget about what the empirical evidence is, but can we agree that reason alone will not answer the question?
Reason alone cannot answer that, but evidence may not also be forthcoming to answer it as well.
Okay, so let's do very slowly and construct this. So if you and I agree, which we do, that reason alone cannot answer the question, then I think it follows from that we can also agree, to the extent that you're remotely knowledgeable about the domain of philosophy. Many philosophers have tried to do this. They've tried to kind of reason their way to these things, but that you can't. The way that you answer that question is through science. It's not through really cool syllogisms, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. And in fact, I want to just amplify that one more step, because I, as a Jew, find it very distasteful when someone like Stephen C. Meyer or someone like William Lane Craig, all these guys have three names. I'd love, Prince and Madonna got by with just one. Right. I'm doing fine with two. But they will start with the following chain of syllogisms. They will start by saying anything that exists had a beginning, kind of the
kalam.
First mover. Yep, the kalam argument. Then they will say that which came, from something, also, cannot come from nothing. And then they will say things that were created had a creator. Right. And then finally they will say Jesus is therefore God.
Correct.
And that's difficult for me as a practicing Jew, though not at the level of, my friend Ben Shapiro, that we can't necessarily get to an extrapolation or proof of a creator, let alone a personal creator. It's clear you need such things, but that smacks of the same type of infinite regress. And it's usually formed in the same way as saying, well, if God is eternal, then who created God? And then you get into these infinite turtles as well.
Right. Okay. So the Jesus part is not part of the kalam, but he adds that in as you need a personal creator. And if anybody's wondering about where they can see the best summary of Craig's views, not read or listen. It's his debate with Alex Rosenberg. Just watch the Craig part. I wouldn't watch the Rosenberg part, but he lays that out in perfect syllogistic format. But I think that so many people have been hoodwinked by thinking that they can reason to certain conclusions about the nature of reality, but reason is not the tool that will get you there. Now, let's bracket for a second what excuse me, what evidence it would take. I'm just looking to formulate an agreement with you that you cannot reason to these things. Excuse me. And if that's true, then much of the domain of philosophy in which philosophers attempt to do this, they're just spinning their, I was going to say a more expression, but they're just spinning their own wheels, right? So you go ahead.
No, I'm agreeing with you. I think, yes, there is and I see people are saying in the chat, oh no, Craig never mentions Jesus. No, but that's not the point. They're not there to prove the existence of a God. They're there to prove the existence of a personal God, or
Right.
else of what use is such an entity, and a God that intervenes and answers prayers and performs miracles and causes evolution, etc. So, so I would say, when we talk about things like the multiverse, it is possible for rational, reasonable people to extrapolate laws of physics in, kind of incontrovertible laws of physics down to the point where they no longer have applicability. Let me give you an example. So we talk about the origin of the universe as originating from a Big Bang. All of our lines of evidence point to the fact that the universe has been evolving, has been getting cooler, has been getting more tenuous, less dense, and hoary in its old age. Now, that implies, based on kind of modus tollens, that you just run the clock backwards, and it was more dense, hotter, more pressure, more dense, etc. Then you come to a point where you get to a point where mathematically you can predict a singularity. Now, what's interesting about singularities, where you divide a finite quantity into an infinitesimal or zero volume, say matter, a finite amount of matter compressed to infinite density is a singularity in density. Those would also be correlated with singularities in pressure and temperature. That's fine to do that. The math works. The maths out just fine. But the physics is completely unpredictable. We can't say what happens once you get below the Planck length, which is something like 10 to the minus 40th meters. When you get to such infinitesimal length scales, the human brain, Peter, is the only organ we think exists in the universe that can contemplate what infinity means. When I put infinity into my computer, I get out not a number. When I take 1 divided by 0, you get not a number, NaN. You don't get a sensible value. The computer can't but we can process it just fine. Human brains can do that, uniquely so. So conversely, I'll just finish this last touch point. The extrapolation mathematically can be used by both William Lane Craig, Lawrence Krauss, and Stephen C. Meyer to extrapolate to a point where it should properly be said that our physics has broken down. Our ability to describe the physical universe with mathematical laws is incomplete.
Okay. There's so much going on here. Okay. So I read and blurbed, actually, someone who was a mentor to me. I didn't really understand because I'm not a particle physicist, but God, I have something in my throat. Excuse me. Victor Stenger wrote God in the Multiverse. And I don't know if you read that, but
I did. I remember you told me about it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so again, he claims that there's sufficient evidence to warrant belief. Now, there's a clip of you to warrant belief in a multiverse, evidence being the key word in that sentence. There's a clip of you talking about the multiverse that Reed will pull up in a second. But here's how it goes from the point of view of many contemporary Christian apologists, led by William Lane Craig. He'll say, and he'll invoke Vilenkin, he'll talk about the Big Bang, and he'll say, the reason that people believe or claim to believe in the multiverse is because they want to deny the God hypothesis. They want to deny the first cause, this kind of Aristotelian boom. And so you have to posit something. So it's more of a kind of metaphysics that's posited to avoid an inevitable epistemological conclusion, and that is that God exists. So I have the following question for you, something I've been wondering about for a long time. Wittgenstein writes, and again, Wittgenstein's obviously not a particle physicist, but he wrote about something that I find to be there's only necessity in logic. There's no necessity in the world. And so when I see people try to think about a unified field theories and come up with string theories, I'm just, again, I'm not a physicist, but I'm wondering, like, why would people even think that there's necessity there? Like, why would people even think that? I understand why someone would think it's possible, but why would someone think it's necessary?
Why would they think it's necessary?
Does that make sense?
Well, just explain one more time what is necessary.
That there even would be a unified field theory. Like, why would anybody think that?
Yeah,
I don't understand.
Yes, I agree. So let's take a step back. What is a unified field theory? And it stakes back to the discovery by none other than another three-name individual, James Clerk Maxwell. And I don't have a doll of him. But what he did is he studied and investigated the properties of electricity and magnetism, which were thought to be two disparate things, as different from one another as a magnetic field is from a gravitational field, as the force that drops this thing down just there, losing my meteorite. And by the way, Peter, because I love college students, and I know you do too, and I love graduate students, postdocs, I even love some professors, Peter, okay? I give away these meteorites to anybody with an EDU email address. If you go to briankeating.com/EDU, and you have an EDU email address, you sign up for it, I will send you guaranteed a chunk of 4.3 billion year old meteorite material. And I'm going to send one to you, Peter, once you become a professor again. No, I really want you down here at UCSD. So, but what Mr. Maxwell, James Clerk Maxwell, did is he reconciled the fact that the electric field imposed on such an object could be understood in another sense by an observer, say in a moving magnetic reference frame, as an electric field, and vice versa. You could convert electric fields to magnetic fields, and it was known that they had something to do with each other, but he unified them. This set off a path of unification that continues to this day with people like my great friend Eric Weinstein and others who are still trying to unify gravity with these three other forces. The three other forces are the strong nuclear force, which is responsible for atomic fission and fusion, the binding together of the nuclei in the movie Oppenheimer. I did a video about that, the physics of Oppenheimer, semi-viral movie on my channel, and that unified that with the belief is that the weak force, which is responsible for what's called radioactive decay, that force is unified. We know now, thanks to the work of Abdus Salam and Steven Weinberg, and Shelley Glashow, that they're unified with electricity and magnetism. In other words, the same types of fields and forces are in sort of this family tree that relate electricity, electric carrying wires and resistors, to magnets, refrigerator magnets, and maybe superconducting devices. Those are related genetically to the weak nuclear force, which couldn't be more shocking. So then the logic took over. Well, if those are unified, maybe the nuclear force that binds proton to proton. Remember, a proton shouldn't be able to bind to a proton, Peter. They're both positively charged. Right. They should repel each other. Well, guess what? They don't, except if you put a neutron in there. So it's very unusual to get two things to stick together that are repulsive, that hate each other. Yeah. That are like the faculty and the bureaucratic staff at the university. You have to bring together a different element, a different type of constituent, like a student. And that moderates the force of repulsion and causes a force of attraction. That's called the grand unified theory, or GUT. And then finally, if gravity could be made to be unified with those other three forces, we'd have a theory of everything. But we don't currently even have, and I say even, I'm not a theorist, but we don't have, and I don't want to minimize, it's very hard to do. Yeah. A grand unified theory. Right. And yet we're looking for theories of everything. So I always joke, Peter, it's hilarious dad jokes that I'm known for. We're putting the toe before the gut. So you have to be careful with that. Don't put the toe before the gut.
So the fact that I followed 99% of that tells me that you're an incredibly good explainer.
I love teaching.
So, okay. So let me repeat back to you the answer to my question. So you're saying that that there's not necessarily a necessity that there's a unified field theory, but because other elements have been unified at different scales, we can extrapolate and make reasonable inferences from that it's very likely. I don't want to give a probability vector to that, but it's at least likely
It's
that
possible.
there could. Okay, well, that's the question. It's okay. So is it possible? So is it what degree of possibility? Is it possible to the extent that it's likely? I mean, I don't want to get too far down the weeds but
there are people that claim the success of the unification of electricity and magnetism together, and then electricity, magnetism, and the weak force provides ample hope and reason to search for a grand unified theory. I think the notion that there's a theory of everything which unifies all four forces together is taken for granted. As I said, people pursue that because here's the deal, Peter. What happens is people think in physics, they have a target on this guy's back. This is Albert Einstein, if you're listening, and they want to shoot that target. They want to say that where he failed, I will succeed. So I get letters, I get emails. Professor Keating, Einstein was wrong. I can show you how to unify this. I'm not good in math. So if you help me prove it, then we can split the Nobel Prize together and I'll only take, 2/3. Okay. So we get a lot of that because it's the paragon of the human brain as Einstein, and where he failed, if I can succeed, therefore I get all his Dungeons and Dragons hit points, his life force, and I am superseding him.
Now you're speaking my language, Brian. You're speaking my language. Keep going.
You roll the icosahedral dice, and then you're in bed. No. So, but that's not to say there aren't reasons to pursue it. As I mentioned, Eric Weinstein is very much convinced that he has a contender theory of everything that explains a lot, but it has to admit other currently unobservable phenomena, such as the fact that in his theory there are multiple time dimensions. So we've talked about space-time in physics for years. That's the unification of space, up, down, left, and right, and forwards and backwards, namely the 3 dimensions of degrees of freedom in space, with the time dimension. I want to meet you for this podcast. I had to be in a certain place at a certain time. That's 4 dimensions needed to be adhered to.
Right.
What Eric and others have thought about is, well, what if you extrapolated that to even higher dimensions? In Eric's case, something like 10 dimensions. And what if time is not a monorail that goes in one direction? It could potentially go backwards and forwards, but there's an orthogonal time direction that we have no real connection to. And Hawking and others did postulate that as well. So he's in good company. Now, there are other theorists like Sheldon Glashow, who won the Nobel Prize for the unification of electricity and magnetism. He also tried a similar vein. There's something called Petit Salam. Ed Witten has tried to do this with string theory.
Dude, Ed Witten is behind everything, virtually everything that's just insanely out there. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a lot of trouble with him. He is one of the foremost self-hating, anti-Israel, Jew-hating, who's Jewish.
He is truly on his own level. Like Ed Witten is. He's just another.
If you look at his Twitter feed, you'd think that he's like a Noam Chomsky or somebody. But
really?
In terms of his feeling about Israel, it's nothing about physics or math, only about Israel's atrocities, carried out against the Hamas and Palestinian government.
It's amazing with all this stuff that he does. He thinks about anything else. But okay, so
we get back to it.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, so I what I would like to see is more experimental backing. Not. I think we have an overabundance. I always make the analogy like theoretical ideas are like software. It's relatively cheap because one person can make great software, but it takes a lot of people to build a computer that the software is programmed on. I'm not criticizing theorists at all. I mean, some of my best friends are theorists, but the bottom line is we need to have for empiricism to work.
100%. Okay, so let me ask you a question. So, I'm very friendly with Eric. I like Eric. We just hung out in London with Winston, and I listened to Eric talk about this. I have no idea what he's talking about. Like I could not even it's just so nothing, zero. It just does not. And I was talking to Shermer about this. So here's what I understand. So let's say that Eric is correct. Why doesn't he, and I haven't asked him this, so it's perhaps it should be more, I should have asked him before I asked you, but it's not a dig on Eric. I'm just genuinely curious. Let's say that his, I don't know, is it theories? I guess hypotheses, that would mean they're testable. Speculations. I don't, models. Yeah, probably models would be good. Let's say that his models are correct. Why doesn't he publish that in peer-reviewed journals?
Oh, okay. So now we're getting into like some really controversial stuff. So Eric is perhaps the most interesting and mercurial and delightfully challenging person that I've ever met. I was listening to an interview with Sam Harris, who I hope we can get to Sam, talk about him in a bit. But I was just thinking, like, I get to talk to Eric, and Eric just, to my mind, just completely obliterates in the public intellectual space Sam on every level, and he's so much more kind of just articulate, but his ability to articulate and his humility, which I don't believe Sam has at the same level. I forgot. Do you know Sam well or no?
Very well.
And I don't want to, I'd love to talk to Sam. He's never been on like a very high level, scientifically oriented podcast. I mean, he's been on with many people, and maybe he's not
a physicist though.
No, but I've had on, I talked to economists, to Nobel Prize winning economy. I don't need to. People come on the show not just to talk about physics.
I thought you meant to talk about Eric's theory.
No, not at all. No, I'm just saying, like, he was talking about other things. So what I mean to say about Eric is that Eric's mind works in multiple dimensions in ways that normal people can't really contemplate. So, for example, when we talk about peer review, he is already like 5 steps down the road. So if you ask Eric, he will say peer review should not be part of science. In fact, his pinned tweet on Twitter for a long time was, we should talk about this graph. And it was, the Google Ngram of how many times peer review has been mentioned in a given past 100 years. And it was 0 until the 40s, and then it spiked up. Okay, so that's one thing. Peer review is not that traditional. It's not that relevant. Number 2, who started peer review as a kind of sine qua non of good science, or shibboleth? Well, it turns out there was this publishing company called Pergamon, I believe, and they were affiliated with a couple of other people. And then all these academic universities had to buy subscriptions to journals. And then the journals hire, reviewers, but they don't pay them anything. And all that's true. And then one of the leaders and the funders of this peer review kind of industry was Jeffrey Epstein's father. Okay. So for that reason, he's like unwilling. There are other, and he should speak for himself if he's interested in coming on. But the bottom line is, he does not hold by peer review. So this is not something that, in fact, when he published, quote unquote, his most recent disputations about what he calls geometric unity, it was first shown on Joe Rogan's podcast, immediately shown on mine, live from Austin, Texas, from his hotel room. And we went into the details of it that, Joe is not going to go into on the physicist level. Right. But he copyrighted it as a work of entertainment so that it could not be plagiarized by forces such as those that Eric has claimed proof and demonstrable proof has copied his ideas in the past. And some of his claims are very meritorious, in my opinion. Not all of them necessarily. I'm not saying he's lying, but I'm just saying I haven't investigated them. But at least 1 or 2 I've personally investigated and found him to be correct. So peer review is good for science. So I actually disagree with Eric. I take the Churchillian perspective that peer review is the worst form of advocacy and argumentation about science and discourse, except for all the others. In that we have this tradition, and it's not perfect. I just got back from London myself, and while I was in London, I had the great honor of speaking at the Royal Institution. This is one of the—
I saw that. Excellent. Yeah, congratulations.
Oldest. Yeah, it was a wonderful thing, and it was where Michael Faraday, who first invented the concept. We talk about fields. He came up with the idea of the field What is a magnetic field? What is an electric field? And I got to use his exact experiments, wax paper with iron filings and magnets. And it was a treat of a lifetime. My wife and two of my kids there. It was such a wonderful treat, Peter. I can't explain it. And it's part of what's called the discourse, which is never supposed to end. In other words, I was locked in a room and they didn't announce who I was. They didn't introduce me. I just come bursting out through this door
in a Faraday cage.
This continuing lecture series that never ends, dating back to apocryphally when some speaker failed to show up and Michael Faraday had to give the lecture. Anyway, getting back to this. So when I did that, I was reminded that this is the way that people would announce things, that they would do discovery. They wouldn't do it in a journal. A journal didn't exist in 1826. Instead, they would come there and say, I believe that this chunk of meteorite, which your .edu email address will get you, is 4 billion years old. And they would do an experiment with a Geiger tube or, some sort of, proof. Or J.J. Thomson demonstrated the existence of the electron, like live in person. It was incredible. And I was using some of their same equipment. So that's an alternative, right? So you could think of other alternatives. You could think of subject or domain expertise. I will say, though, that it is very difficult to construe a way of adversarial, but it should be not ad hominem critiquing of scientific presentations. And Eric is of the opposite. He thinks it's bad for science. I think it's neutral to slightly good, and especially compared to all the others.
Could Eric demonstrate his model live?
No, he's not. It's not an experimental model. So the access to this, if you've seen Oppenheimer, you plan to first check out my video on my channel about the physics of Oppenheimer, because they left out all the physics, all the fun nerdy stuff that I went to go see it for. And I was like, I got as much physics out of Barbie as that. But when you talk about the physics of the nuclear, now we're talking about the physics of space-time. So to go from the electronic scale, the scale of chemistry, the scale of refrigerator magnets, the energy scale associated with an electric shock, it may hurt you. Now you go to the nuclear scale and you have Hiroshima. Okay. Now what Eric wants to do is get to the sub-nuclear scale, the space-time scale. Can you imagine the conflagration that it would take to demonstrate such a theory? So no, Peter, we couldn't demonstrate it in front of the
so maybe I spoke in haste. What I should have said is, so this is a model. Speaking of which, I published a piece with James Lindsay and Victor Stenger in Scientific American before it was ideologically captured. That's one of the things I thought you were going to say about models, about that the journals have been captured and they skew one way. But so is it at least in theory capable of being demonstrated that it aligns with reality? I don't want to say that it's true.
Oh yeah. So you could. But we don't do these like live, like a magic show anymore. And there was an element of showmanship, and there was stuff that I did, that's just like, it is like a live magic trick, right? But no, I mean, what Eric should do is indeed publish it, and indeed look for criticism of it, respond to that criticism. The problem with Eric's theories, ideas, is because he's such an influential public intellectual, because he's probably one of the brightest living human beings. And I've interacted, I've had 14 Nobel Prize winners on my podcast, and I'm not saying this lightly, but Eric easily can hold his own with any of them, from economics to astrophysics. Okay. But his intellect goes beyond that. Because of that, he's attracted a huge cadre of people that would love to see him fail, be humiliated.
100%. I see that 100%. Yeah, he has a massive target on his back. And just to buttress what you're saying, every time I've hung out with Eric, I found him to be, I found everything you've said about him to be absolutely true. He's very affable as well. I really like him as a person.
Oh yeah.
But with all that being said, I have literally nothing to say to him about physics. I just don't know enough I wouldn't even begin to know a root, you know what I'm saying? So like having that conversation with me would be totally pointless.
No, in fact, so I've done that. I've had him down. I've invited him down to UCSD a couple of years ago. He was sort of a visitor, permanent visitor. And now he's, on occasion will visit me from LA. But we actually had a quote unquote debate with another colleague of mine, Daniel Green, who's a brilliant young, 30s, 40s guy's good looking, brilliant, great father, great, he's just a guy you hate, right? But I love him. But and they talked and debated live, and there was great comedy. They did not fight with each other. There's no ad hominem attacks. And I could tell Eric left that conversation feeling energized and alive, knowing that there were not only, physics kind of wannabes out there, but actual, highly cited practicing theoretical cosmologists that were taking him seriously, that could debate with him, that he could hold his own with, and at some levels go deeper. And so, but when you have people on the internet, who want to see him fall, like dedicate podcasts that go on venues and then attack his paper using pseudonymous names, so that you can't verify, is this person the same person that said something that was misgendering somebody? Or was that person somebody who's causing people to come to people's houses? We don't know, because that person's name is not. So at that level, now there is a very public critic who has made his name known online and is frequently critic, and he also loves to try to engage me in it. And I actually
know who that is.
I think he's a brilliant.
We won't use his name. Let's not use his name.
I don't care. But he's had like 4 or 5 podcasts, Peter, on his podcast about me, my book, Eric, trying to get other scientists to comment on the quality of my science or some of the things, and why is it bad that I don't have him on my podcast. Look, I find it flattering at some level, because every time he mentions me, I get this great boost, because he's such a brilliant young guy, this guy who's criticizing Eric. However, I don't find that he's acting in good faith. I feel like he wants to,
the problem.
And I've seen attacks, and so anyway, I'm happy to talk to anybody. They have to be doing it in good faith, and they have to be doing it from a point of view of trying to have clarity, not just taking somebody down and like standing over them and revealing them to be the grifter and everything else.
That's what happens when you move at high levels in the public space, is that the number of lunatics who come out of the woodwork in bad faith accusations. I mean, if you think it's bad,
I don't think this guy's a lunatic at all. I think
no. I'm not talking about him specifically. I'm just talking about the number of insane people who come out who literally has a huge target. And if you think it's bad for Eric, it's it's so much worse for his brother. I mean, they come after Brett like crazy, like. And just the sheer vituperation, the sheer nastiness, and that's part of the problem, is you don't really know if it's 50 people or 5,000 people, like 50 people with 100 kind of sock puppet accounts. So there is a kind of, and I do think that there's something, Musk is, and it's not Twitter, it's called X now. There's something about the anonymity in those that bothers me, in a way that when you move in the public space, you just have to be, when you move in a public space at a high level, and you have these huge targets on your back, like you have, like Eric has, I
mean, something you'd never say in person, right? If somebody were to say to me about my friend Eric, if they were to say he's a grifter and a fraud, you're going to find something out about me, and the kind of physicality that I'm willing to maintain if you're actively threatening me or my friends. Okay, now on the internet that doesn't happen, right? I mean, people, there's no repercussion. You're not going to get punched in the face. Somebody once said that, and actually one of the things that Sam Harris did say that I did agree with is like, most of the worst weekends of my life, in the last 10 years were because of something I said on Twitter. That's what he said. So why are we inviting this thing in the, it's just because I'm a narcissist and I want public affirmation.
Okay. So okay. So that right there, I have to pause you and say, it's like, okay. So when you do this thing that we do, when people come after you online, you just can't, you just have to be non-phased by it. You just cannot let these people get to you, because the moment that happens, Helen Pluckrose, they've really done a number on her.
Oh yeah.
They've called her horrible things, mostly about her weight. And she had a problem, like a cyst was on her brain, and she used to be an athlete. And what people have said about her and done to her is horrific, instead of engaging her ideas. But you just can't let these people get to you. That's the thing.
No, I agree.
And that's why I was wondering, why about the whole peer review with Eric thing, why that just doesn't go through peer review. And I thought you were going to say that the journals were institutionally captured, but that reminds me, if I can just, use the word orthogonal. I love that word. If I can just go to something, the whole Joe Rogan put up $10,000 or $100,000 to debate.
Peter Hotez.
Yep, with RFK.
Yeah.
I'm interested in your take on that, but because it parallels this conversation.
Yeah.
But I'd like to give you mine, and maybe you tell me if my thinking, my reasoning is in error. So Peter went on his podcast before, so he already moved in the public space. He has a Twitter account, so he's not a scientist who has avoided the public space.
That's right.
So I think it's incumbent upon him, because he's in the public space, to accept that challenge. I
agree. Yeah. So I'd love to talk to Joe Rogan about this, and God willing, someday I'll get that chance, Peter. But I thought, there is this constant refrain from Peter Hotez. First of all, there are all these baseless, really slimy kind of accusations that Joe was doing that as kind of like an anti-Semitic trope. I didn't even know Peter Hotez is Jewish.
That's insane.
I'm not even sure he is, but I was
like crazy talk. Yeah.
Yeah. It was a reporter from the Atlantic or the New York Times. It was David Froome, I think.
Oh yeah.
So I wrote David Froome back. I was just like, it's already bad because this anti-Semite already had Peter Hotez on his pod. It was clear like he didn't even know that he had been on, like, Froome was saying, "Oh, don't give him a platform." Okay, it's a great line, except for when you actually do a second of research as a reporter and see that he had already been on the podcast and treated wonderfully. Second of all, when he says, "Oh, we don't debate," that's nonsense. We do debate. We don't allow a debate on Twitter or Joe Rogan Experience to count and replace substitutionally peer review. On the other hand, we also, it wasn't just that he said, well, I won't, like, scientists don't debate. So you're saying if you had on, if I could talk to, Eric Topol, who I have talked to, and, you wouldn't debate him. He felt we shouldn't give the vaccine out before the 2020 election because that would redound to Trump's benefit. So I claim if he believed that, Peter, and correct me if I'm wrong, logically speaking, but if Eric believed that was true, Eric Topol, and it turned out that the vaccine indeed did save lives, then by withholding the vaccine from the public and using his influence to do so, then lives were lost. I don't think you can say both things. The vaccine is 100% effective, or it was effective, saved lives. Right. And if it was administered earlier, it wouldn't have saved. So anyway, would Peter Hotez not debate one of the foremost, researchers and public figures, namely Eric Topol? Of course he would. So it's a nonsense to say that they don't participate in public debate. He didn't want to. And he knows that RFK is more skilled, but I actually don't think RFK is the best exemplar of this point. But that should redound to Peter Hotez's benefit, because yes, he may be more skilled oratorially, but scientifically, shouldn't Peter Hotez have so much better scientific apparatus and Joe mediate and moderate that? So I thought it was a cop-out.
Okay, so let me ask you at least one, perhaps two questions. I want to see if we can find agreement or if we disagree on this. Would you agree that if somebody was a scientist with no Twitter account, never been on a podcast, but they worked in this field, and then somebody challenged them to a debate, there's just a public debate in a public forum, there's just they shouldn't have to do. I mean, they should consider it, but it is an unreasonable expectation for other people to want them to do that. Would you agree that if someone already does not move in the public space, that there's no compulsion to do so?
I actually think that scientists who do receive public funding have a moral obligation to engage with the public at some level. It doesn't mean like every time they're challenged by a flat earther, I have to go and debate them and put on my debating clogs and do that. No, it means that I receive public funding and I have a responsibility as a mensch and as an individual who is responsible for the fiduciary obligation that we have as scientists to spend other people's money, namely U.S. taxpayers, to do it wisely and to do it judiciously. That's an obligation that I feel I have. That's the reason I started my YouTube channel and so forth. If you don't want to do that, that's fine. I often get the saying, I actually had a conversation with this guy, Dave Farina, who actually calls people like Stephen C. Meyer and others charlatans, grifters, just hateful individuals. I mean, he is really vehemently antagonistic towards the Discovery Institute, towards this guy, James Tour, and other people. But he even said, well, no, it's not in their skill set. I want them staying in the lab where they'll do the most good. I said, imagine you work for AT&T and you're doing, marketing for them, and your boss comes by and your boss says, hey, Brian, what are you up to? And you say, look, I'm doing very complicated things that you may not understand, and so forth, Mr. Boghossian. You would say, pack up your stuff by the end of the day and the security guard will take away your badge, because you have no right to tell me how you are too intelligent, erudite, and wise, and you should have a blank check on how you spend your money with no accountability and no fiduciary duty. And yet that's what we as scientists are doing. So
Okay.
There is an obligation. There's not an obligation to meet me on the Potter's Field at 6 a.m. with pistols at dawn. That's not relevant.
Okay, so part of that claim is that if you take public money, you have a duty. You have to discharge your duty to the public, and that would take. So I can see that. That wouldn't necessarily. You could discharge your duties other than debating. Okay, so let me ask you one more question on this, because I find this fascinating, and I'll just tell you what I think. It seems to me that because RFK, now, is he a viable presidential candidate? I don't know, but he has a large X following, I don't know, Twitter, whatever you want. He has a very large public platform. A lot of people listen to him. It would seem to me, given that there's an additional responsibility on someone who is a scientist because of the political nature of both the claim and the person with whom you'd be having that discussion. Is my reasoning? I mean, what do you think about that?
I mean, do they have an obligation, or to be part?
Obligation might be too strong, but because this is a presidential candidate with not an unreasonable likelihood of success, but there just seems to be an additional gravitas or duty or responsibility because it's RFK.
Well, let me flip it around you. So if I've learned nothing else, by the way, when you were on my podcast, it was such a delight, and I really want you back on. I want to do it in person in my new Impossible Studios. But
awesome.
But Peter, the comments were like, because I was asking you things, we were debating religion and talking about like experts and follow the science and what does that mean, and then in the comments, there were all these comments like, Peter's using all the tools of how to have impossible conversations with Brian Keating in real time, and Keating is too oblivious to understand he is getting one pulled. Anyway, so I'm going to pull one over on you. Okay. So let me take the opposite. So let me say this. Okay. Is it reasonable that Peter Hotez shouldn't engage with somebody who has said things conflating vaccines with autism, and conflating the fiduciary venality of the pharmaceutical industry with their profit motive and with their policy directives? And so for engaging with these people, would it not be like, Ben Shapiro runs for office, and he's asked to debate a Holocaust denier. Yeah. Now, I hate the word vaccine denier. I hate climate denier. I just had on a wonderful professor at NYU, Stephen Koonin, who's been called a climate change denier. Right. I've been called a multiverse denier. It cheapens the currency of the word denier.
That's awesome. A multiverse denier. Oh my God.
My wife denied me. She didn't let me hold her hand last night over dinner. I've been denied a lot of things in life, Peter. Don't cry for me. But the bottom line is, to what obligation do you have? Now, on a platform like Rogan, I thought it was disingenuous, which doesn't mean that he wasn't right to maybe not debate with RFK himself. I think RFK is a very skilled orator. He's been in the public sphere for a long time. He's got bona fides. So I think Hotez was, I think he was scared to do it. I think he's
for
maybe
sure.
smart not to do it. And maybe there's some venue, but he wasn't actively proposing it. So let's say Eric doesn't want to do peer review, or Sam Harris doesn't want to be on Twitter. Are there ways that they can have their own echo chamber punctured rather? And I found this listening to Sam. He's so kind of he's such a brilliant mind that I think in his mind he's convinced himself that there are no flaws in his logic, and so it is like debating, is 2 + 2 = 5, and so it's not worth his time. On the other hand, there's ample evidence to show that a lot of the things that he would claim were preferable to Trump, never happened. I listened to a podcast that he did with this guy Scott Galloway, who's a professor, so-called professor at NYU. He's not like teaching staff, and he is a Prof G. He's on with Kara Swisher. They have a podcast, if you know her. No. I think she called for Ben Shapiro to be deplatformed once to Susan Wojcicki on YouTube because her son likes to watch Ben Shapiro. Anyway, so this conversation was from 2020, and it was all about the dangers of reelecting Trump and how it's an existential threat. Right. And so Scott and Sam Harris were debating how it could lead to like a new invasion of Ukraine. It could lead to tensions with Iran, and it could lead to, Chinese interference and I'm like, do you guys like ever do an audit on yourselves, like Scott Galloway or Sam Harris? Do you ever look back and say, look, when we predicted this, we were wrong. Like, I made a mistake. And that's fine to do that. And I actually and this is totally different context. I just did an interview with a renowned theoretical physicist. Your paper, the hermeneutic penis.
Oh yeah, the conceptual penis is a social construct. Penis. One of the highest in gender studies. It's one of the most cited papers in all of gender studies. In the top tier, that is.
Do you know what your H index is, or what that paper's?
No, but the funny thing is, it's still cited as a real paper, even though it's not available online anymore. It's still it's still cited.
That testifies to the rigidity, to the durability of the conceptual penis.
Thank you.
But let me tell you something. There's something called an H index, and we're going to nerd out as professors. That is the number of papers that you have that have at least H citations. So it's a metric, a parametric measurement of your throughput and creativity and output as a professor or as a scientist. Okay, so someone could have one paper that has 1 million citations and never write another paper, and that's interesting, that's useful, that might be a one-hit wonder. Or someone could have 10,000 papers that have each been cited 100 times, and that might be even more indicative of that professor's impact on the field. So it's an impact factor assessment. The person who invented that statistic is Jorge Hirsch. I think the H stands for Hirsch. He's my colleague at UCSD. He was a very great skeptic of the superconductor that's recently been announced to be operational at room temperature. And I know you want to get into type 2, type 1 superconductors,
I actually do.
Phase 1 superconductors, and also talk about levitation and the Meissner effect, and we will do that.
And quantum computers.
I just had him on my podcast a few hours ago, and he's changed his mind. And he's big enough to do it. He's one of the biggest naysayers. So Sam Harris can't come out and say, look, I was wrong. I don't think we would have had a fascist state. I think we maybe have descended more into kind of fascist or suppression of free speech under Biden, potentially. And maybe Biden is more as corrupt as I thought when I said on trigonometry that, he could have, dead babies on his laptop and that wouldn't affect. Anyway, this is all to say that there's no obligation to debate, but I think you shouldn't shy away from it. And if you do, find another venue. Say, I don't want to debate. Let's have a debate on peterboghossian.com. Let's have a written debate, or let's do it live, or whatever. But to say completely it's not, he's beneath me, I think that's insulting to the scientific process.
Yeah, I mean, I can speculate the psychological reasons and the social reasons why he didn't want to debate. But you've mentioned Sam Harris a number of times, so I think we should talk to that. But beforehand, hey, Reed, pull up we have a super chat question about the trustworthiness of science. And thank Maverick Christian. We appreciate this. I have a nonprofit. Everything goes to the nonprofit to allow us to do this.
And I get 20% of it, right?
You get 20% of it, just 20. Whether to trust the majority scientific opinion in practice boils down to who do you trust when you lack the relevant expertise to judge BS, which can go awry. For example, creationism. We should talk about that because Dawkins does not debate creationists because he says it gives them the quote oxygen of legitimacy. And how do you navigate that? So That's actually a great question for you.
Yeah. So when I think about, who do you trust? You have to trust is earned just like in life. And all of us have a moral and ethical bank account. And I think you can draw
Yeah.
upon it. You could be right. I may have declared that we discovered the imprimatur of the singularity that began our universe, but I also was part of a team that retracted it and worked to overturn it. And that's the story of my first book, losing the Nobel Prize. Spoiler alert, I lost the Nobel Prize.
Great book, by the way. Loved it.
Thank you very much. And yet, you should have the intellectual capacity to say that does not invalidate you. There's a trope that a scientist only has to be right once in their life to be a successful career, and only wrong once to have no career. That's not really true. The problem is that the public communication of science is a unidirectional ratchet that only allows the amplification of sensationalism and never the actual sausage retraction being made. And I'll give you an example. So when there are claims like the one involving my experiment, BICEP, or say one involving a room temperature superconductor from years ago, or cold fusion, that comes out on the front page of every newspaper around the world.
Correct.
And it happened to us. And
100%.
It comes out and it leads above the fold. And then if there is a retraction, that will occur on page B17 of the Saturday edition, which is the least read of all 7 editions of the newspaper. If at all, it'll never be on TV. And so I've called for rather controversial sort of a PR budget ratio where you have in reserve, you have to publicize your results. You're getting taxpayer money. All of us scientists are funded by the taxpayers, even though people like me who receive a lot of private funding, and the preponderance of my funding is from a private foundation. Nevertheless, I teach at a public university. I've been educated in the public school system my whole life, et cetera, et cetera. So for these reasons, we have an obligation. However, we should keep some of our budget in reserve. I've called 10, 20%. Call it in reserve to publicize at the same level of attention that the initial announcement got. And you must keep working with the media. And I call this the academic media hype cycle, because something will be found, like a claim that the universe is 26 billion years old. And that'll be one person working in Ottawa, Canada, is a legitimate professor. And he will claim this, and then it will get picked up by a couple of physics, news sources that have the word physics in it or scientist in it. And then Joe Rogan will post it. And then Elon Musk will retweet and ask questions about dark matter subsequent to it. And this really happened 2 weeks ago. So if I ever do talk to Joe, I'm going to bring this up because the fact is, having this one researcher kind of present a single finding that's not vetted or really consistent or coherent with the majority of the field. And it turns out this researcher also had felt pressure from his home institution to make a press release, which then gets picked up by a local newspaper, which then goes to a national website, which then goes to Joe Rogan. So this got tens of millions of views. Now, if it turns out, as I think it is, incorrect, it doesn't mean he's a fool or he's an idiot. It just means that his logical reasoning process was meant to fit an outcome rather than blindly apply to data as a random control, trial. So it would hopefully allow us to do. So if that occurs, is Joe Rogan going to put out another tweet? I was wrong. This isn't, he might, I'm blaming Joe. I'm not really mad at him, but I'm just saying when the propensity, as Mark Twain said, or somebody said, maybe it was Sam Clemens, not Mark Twain, that, a lie goes all the way around the world before the truth puts on its pants. I'm not saying these are liars, not saying these are fraudsters, but the lack of resources, financial resources dedicated to this. And I get this from a Talmudic perspective. It'll be interesting. So in the Talmud, if you attempt if you say, Peter says, I witnessed Brian Keating trying to murder somebody.
Okay.
Or actually murdering somebody.
Okay.
And you didn't actually see that. And if you did see it, I would be convicted of that and I would be put to death. If you say that, Peter, and it's proven that you lied, then you get the punishment. You get executed. Okay. In other words, the thing that you would have brought upon me gets brought upon you. So I'm using this in the Talmudic sense to apply to scientific publication retractions. The amount of attention you had put into this to either garner attention, research funding, Nobel Prizes, fame, attention, that you must maintain in reserve an insurance policy. And that insurance policy is to retract at the same level that you promoted it.
Okay, so I followed, and I agree, bracketing the death thing. I followed, and I agree with what you say. And what's making it made me think about something that I've been thinking about for a while. It's just this idea of the death of expertise. It's how we've come to a legitimation crisis or a legitimacy crisis in our institutions. We're inherently distrustful of expertise. And you've spoken with Jay Bhattacharya about this, and others have spoken, but Brett has spoken about this. And do you think, by and large, and Reed, can we pull up some of those, Nature, Scientific American, that slide from the Mentimeter? Yeah, the following scientific institutions are trustworthy. So I was wondering if you could comment on, and not necessarily the mechanisms, or you can certainly do that if you'd like. Like Scientific American is completely lost. I mean, I'm just amazed at what's happened to that. These venerable legacy institutions, the journal Nature, Center for Disease Control, World Health Organizations. And then I have a good friend of mine who works for the CDC, and I'll tell you what she said. What do you think about like the fact that are these trustworthy, and how do you relate that to expertise? And if you can, to the legitimacy. This is a complex question. I'm trying to not ask compound questions, but
no, you're better than me, because that's
to the legitimacy crisis.
Yeah.
So what do you think about like the trustworthiness of our institutions and the fact that the public just? My buddy said to me the other day, if there actually is a pandemic that's literally like Black Plague level, no one's going to believe it. Like,
yeah,
literally.
Don't, by the way, don't say if, say when. And I talked to Jay about this on my podcast as well. And it's
no one's gonna believe it.
This could be kind of a preview and a terrifying one at that of the real pandemic. God forbid, Peter. Imagine if, or Zeus, or whatever you believe, nothing, nature forbid, that there is a pandemic and it kills not the 89-year-old, people in nursing homes, which is tragic, but 8 and 9-year-olds. Okay.
Yeah.
So just imagine what it would wrench society. I don't think we would have the same kind of planetary scale reaction that we did. And so did we dodge a bullet? Well, but maybe we didn't, because the next one could attack, God forbid, as I say. And then we got all these people, like my kids had to go in for their Tdap, vaccine. I was like, well, how many people really get tetanus in the US? I was like looking at, I remember talking to Brett Weinstein on my podcast, and he was like, I got the rabies shot. And I was like, oh, well, big freaking deal. Yeah, I got a tetanus. And he's like, no, like very few human beings get the rabies shot. Like, it's so rare that you get rabies. And he had to go to like collect fruit bats or something, whatever. So the bottom line is, like, you start thinking about this, well, like, or like the HPV vaccine, oh, cures cancer. Well, how many, like, am I saying to my wife, like, we are expecting our kids to have sex out of wedlock, and when they do, they will be sleeping with a partner who has these polyps, or has this hepatitis or whatever it is, and then they'll get cancer. Like, what are we saying here? Like,
yeah. So just to pause that for a second. So HPV is linked to cervical cancer in women.
That's right.
And so there's some really interesting literature on that I read a while ago, and about public health campaigns, et cetera. So the HPV vaccine is, if they have sex, that they're, you want to ward off that possibility of cancer. So I think I believe it's a no-brainer.
The most probable age that they would get cancer is in their 60s. And there's, for my son, let's say, does he need it? Because it's meant to prevent. Anyway, I'm not saying not to get it or get it. I think that is a personal decision. I'm just saying, like, how many people are really getting it? And then what does it say about individual? Because it's different than even the COVID vaccine, so-called vaccine. I don't really call it a vaccine, because it didn't really seem to do what a vaccine typically does with dead viruses and so forth. But anyway, let's call it a vaccine. Whereas this is saying something about, like, the sexual, like, it's 100% preventable disease. I mean, you may not like it if I say, well, you could prevent AIDS by never having sex whatsoever, getting any transfusions. That's pretty rare nowadays too. Like, it's not politically correct to say that, but it is true. It is theoretically 100%. I'm not advocating people don't have sex, gay sex, heterosexual sex, whatever you like. Okay. But I'm just saying, the fact is, scientifically, you can't argue with that. But now we have to debate this because of the ideological capture of some of these institutions. So if Scientific American tells me that we successfully deflected an asteroid before it entered the Earth and produced more meteorites that your audience can get at briankeating.com, I will trust that. The problem is they're like a weather forecaster who's like 50% right, 50% wrong, and especially at Scientific American, where they've decided that their mission is to wade into gender ideology forcefully, reporting facts and sort of our opinions as facts. And I don't bias, but this is a long-standing trend. And here's where I witnessed it in my first book, Losing the Nobel Prize, was the statement that 70 Nobel Prize winners advocate voting for Hillary Clinton or for Joe Biden. And every 4 years we get the same thing. It's always just look up X number of Nobel Prize winners, why you should vote for the Democrat. It doesn't matter who the Democrat is. It could be like somebody who's anti-science or what have you. So they all vote. So is that a capture? Are the Nobel lists themselves captured? I talked to one recently and I was like, I noticed you had like in your signature, you have your pronouns. And I know you very well, this Nobel laureate. And I was like, did you do that? Like, was that important to you? Or like, because maybe I should do it, And he's like, I didn't know, like, no, I didn't agree to this or that. And I was like, well, this is strange. Like, it's like in your signature or And so I'm wondering to what extent that we need to rely on experts comes down to the human brain's unwillingness to accept what I call Schrodinger states, ambiguous states. It's much easier to be 100% say F Scientific American, screw.
So when you talked about, would you believe Scientific American if they told you that we had some way to deflect a meteor? I mean, I know literally nothing about it, but if I had a dial that said yes, no, maybe, I would go to yes. But when it came to anything that was morally fashionable, specifically race, gender, trans issues, etc., not only would I say no, but I would say it's almost invariably the truth is the opposite of that thing. So I think it depends in the subdomain about the articles. And our mutual friend Michael Shermer, who's come up, one of my closest friends, he used to be a longstanding columnist for Scientific American, and until it got ideologically captured. But I just don't know, Brian, this is a larger issue, but I just don't know how we can function as a society with all of these institutions captured and large swaths of the country not trusting them. And what's really frightening about that to me is that among the people who trust them, they are also in the orbit of the ideology. So if they actually knew, and Socrates talks about this in the Theaetetus and a little bit in the Republic, but if they actually knew what either what went on in the university or what the facts of the matter is, just as a simple thing, and I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but can someone change their sex and not go on this crazy redefining of sex? Jerry Coyne has written about this. Dawkins has written about this. I try to be optimistic, but I just don't know how we can survive as a country when people don't trust experts, when people when there's a wholesale legitimacy crisis in our institutions, and I'm deeply concerned about the country. This kind of
connects back, Peter, to the earlier statement that I believe scientists have a moral obligation to communicate their results in a language the public can understand. And if we don't, it redounds to our detriment, because eventually first funding will dry up, which is bad. But eventually trust will start to dry up, because if I don't talk to my brother, for like 6 months, and then all of a sudden, I have this great opportunity, he's going to be like, well, maybe my brother wouldn't. I don't know. I love him, but but some friend or something that's just a fair weather friend, and he comes up to me only when he needs something. You're not going to trust that person. And so I think the more we can have, scientifically educated or curious, you may not be able to do differential equations like I can, or, my guest can, but to be curious about the scientific process, to be curious about the new discoveries, that is the sine qua non of human beings, that we know based on what our name is. I mean, the name Homo sapien means man who knows. So what is it that we know? It doesn't mean that man who's like knowledgeable. It means wisdom. Like sapienza means wisdom. Scientia, science, means knowledge. So, talking about science as if it's wisdom, I think that's very dangerous. So when people like Fauci or other people work, Collins and so forth, to suppress science, to obfuscate what they're doing, and to censor scientists like Jay Bhattacharya, it's very dangerous, and they should be held to account. That's the first thing. We don't have a Nuremberg trial, but we actually get them together and say, look, this is where we do a postmortem. And I see no interest in doing that. And COVID was a lightning rod, and it was an opening of the eyes for parents, for scientists, for lay people all around the world about this ideological capture that you speak so eloquently about. But again, all this is downstream from academia.
Okay. So truly, I could talk to you truly for hours on end. So I got a bunch of stuff I want to say, but if anybody has a question in the super chat, let's go. From Oceana 23, Peter, have you or your guests read the Lancelets? No, I have not.
No,
I never even heard of it. I'm sorry,
No,
I have not. So let me ask you a question. I heard a little bit on your podcast. I can't remember the person you were speaking to, and I heard Miguel Kaku on Shermer's podcast, and I've heard. So the thing that blows my mind, it blows my mind in the way that I can't even articulate how it blows my mind. Is this whole quantum computing thing, and this does not betray a confidence when I say this. So I have a very good friend who works at a high level at a tech company, and this individual, let's not use their pronoun. This individual told me that one of the reasons that there's I'm trying to think of how to say this without betraying a confidence. But anyway, that the tech companies have placed a significant amount of money betting on quantum computing. To say the least, a non-trivial amount of money. And so I was wondering if you could just give us a brief summary of that, if you feel comfortable doing that, and two, would that lead to? Can you relate the quantum computing to the possible existence of a multiverse?
Not in the remaining 10 minutes or so, but I can speak about each one separately, and I think that's probably the most useful way to do it. There was a claim that there was quantum tunneling and behavior, not unlike a wormhole, and allied phenomena with the multiverse demonstrated in a quantum computer last November by a friend of mine at Caltech. But we won't conflate the two just now. So quantum computing is a breakthrough in the computing process. It was proposed by many people, but most particularly known and popularized by Richard Feynman, as many things were in physics, who's been canceled, in some ways nowadays. So we can talk about that some other time. And the proposal was that there were certain objects, there were certain phenomena that did not lend themselves to the Boolean algebra, the binary logic tree of zeros and ones that are indicative of a classical computer, a semiconductor computer, the kind of which that we are using right now at the trillions and trillions level of transistors on each of our screens. Not to mention all the supporting architecture. So these classical computers work by logic gates that then can be converted to mathematical operations that can process at fractions of the speed of light to do computations much faster than a classical computer could do anything. But a human being could do anything. So these are zeros and ones being processed at near light speed. You can think about it, and you can break down any operation. All language, as you know, from Morse code, is basically zeros and ones. All language, all mathematical operations can be used employing a binary code to operate them. But if you had if you had trinary code or tertiary code or quaternary code, you could do more operations simultaneously. It's still discrete, so you'd still have fourfold algebra and so forth, and beyond. But
Right.
But now you could get to a level we had like near continuous, a near infinite number of bits per quantum transistor, which is called a qubit. So these could take on different values, typically encoded in either their spin of electrons or topological effects, solitons and polarons and light optical quantum computers. And they're found to be incredibly descriptive and useful, these quantum computers, at describing the physics of quantum computers. Right now, a lot of what they do is doing things that need to be highly parallelized. So looking for prime numbers is a very arduous task in mathematics. These objects can do that, and it's pertinent to everything we're doing now, because a lot of encryption is predicated on finding prime factor pairs that can be used to generate public key encryption and then decoded in private. So that is a possibility. To date, that's one of the major opportunities of quantum computers, as well as understanding the properties of quantum systems at very extreme temperatures and pressures, including possibly these newfound room temperature superconductors, if those are confirmed.
We have to talk about that, but we don't have time today. But okay. So is there any relationship between, and I'm sorry if this is such a dumb newbie question, I'm not a physicist, but is there any relationship between quantum computing and the multiverse? So let me ask you the question this way. If at any point in a trajectory of quantum computing, let's say we're able to do utterly extraordinary things, would that be evidence of a multiverse?
No, I mean, they used to say, if you wanted evidence for aliens, you already had it. Fermi's paradox is answered because there are people called Hungarians. And as a Hungarian, I'm very proud of that, and I know you have affection for Hungarians as well.
I'm a big fan. Yeah.
No, there's not necessarily any link between that. There are weird aspects of the multiverse that can be envisioned as so-called splitting of the wave function. So in quantum mechanics, classical mechanics, the position of an object and its velocity specify everything that it can do. In quantum mechanics, you need more variables, but it's similar type of operation conceptually. Now, in fact, though, when you do a quantum measurement, unlike a classical measurement, you completely unavoidably alter the state of that system permanently and irreversibly, collapsing the wave function. So if the so-called double slit experiment or the Schrodinger's cat experiment, when you observe the cat, it's either alive or dead. Before that, it's in this hyper superposition of living and dead, which is bizarre to Einstein and others. Now, in the multiverse, that is called the many worlds hypothesis, popularized by our mutual friend Sean Carroll in his most recent book,
friend.
Something Deeply Hidden. No, I know. He might not like me very much anymore either. But anyway, he did talk about my research on this podcast by this critic of Eric Weinstein, but he was very generous, I should say. So anyway, I love being talked about, even if it's sometimes in a negative spirit. Anyway, the multiverse in that instantiation takes the effect that the cat lives in another universe, even though in our universe it's dead. So that's a form of a multiverse, not in a distant cosmological vantage point.
Okay,
right.
So
here,
that's right. That's the thing. Okay. So
Exactly.
Real quick, we only have a few minutes left. I would love to get you on to talk about room temperature superconductors. I'd love to get you on and really drill down on some of the ideas we've talked about, metaphysics, religion. We didn't really talk about the God hypothesis. I'd love to talk. So I'd love to have you back on. But we have a question in the super chat I want to ask you from BMS. Hit a snag here. My question would have been, how do you view laws against Holocaust denial in countries like Germany and Austria? Understandable in the historic context. Christopher Hitchens was against that. And, you have people like David Irving, deniers, et cetera. So you have any thoughts on that real quick before we end? This curveball question for you.
Yeah. I mean, I don't really feel, that this is something, that is pertinent on such a level as to really warrant policy intervention from a physicist. I would say as a Jew, these things are distasteful, but I actually don't believe in kind of suppression of hate speech. I think that that's kind of a tautology, or it's sort of a logical impossibility that you could have free speech and suppression of hate speech. Let's say there's a baker, who won't make the bar mitzvah cake, for my son. And because I'm a Jew, he just says it. I don't do business with Jews. I don't like Jews. Well, are there not any other bakers that could do it? And should that place be forced out of business by lack of demand? Absolutely so. Should the government come in and shutter it? I think that leads to very dangerous conclusions. I don't know what happens in Germany and Austria. Of course, they were complicit. The people were complicit. They did suffer. And I should say that, to my knowledge, Germany and Austria, especially Germany, has made heroic kind of
I agree.
attempts at reparations, unlike the Japanese in their treatment of Chinese comfort women, Korean, the Holocaust that they committed.
Yeah,
and actually someday will be great to talk about. Yeah, rape of Nanking. I mean, they have done less soul searching, I would say, being an ignoramus about most of these political topics, but then the Germans, which I have great affection for, and I don't, of course historically, but if they're Germans, right? So they can do whatever the hell they want. It's like when people criticize Israel that are Jewish and they say, well, we should do this. Okay, you can move there. I mean, there's nothing preventing you, but like you staying here in America safe and sound from any of the repercussions of your. I don't know what the repercussions are in Germany. I don't know how virulent anti-Semitism still is. I understand it's still active. It's active everywhere. It's like saying, can we eradicate?
It's rising. It's rising its ugly head again. So I just want to say, as an Armenian, someone of Armenian descent, I agreed with everything you said, and I was thinking about, and I want to be respectful of your time. So very, very, very quickly before we wrap it up, I was thinking about, well, what if you were in Pakistan and you had, like, are there ever circumstances when there should be a law requiring such things? Like about your son's bar mitzvah cake, and if anti-Semitism was so malignant and so widespread and ubiquitous, would you need those laws? In other words, that's, for example, why we have a constitution to protect some basic rights. So states can make their own whatever they want to do, but they can't contradict the Constitution, right? We can't. So right. I was just thinking about cultural and historical context. Okay, so real quick, we're going to finish up. But what do you do? Like, are you like? I don't even know. What are you working on now? Are you working on like? Can you explain? And maybe this is unfair, but given that we only have moments left, but like, what are you doing with? I don't even know how to phrase the question. Like, are you doing experimental stuff, or like, what are you working on now intellectually in your field?
So in 1609, Galileo took the first look at the heavens through a small telescope. And ever since that time, I've got props here, Peter. I've no shortage of those or dad jokes. And when he did that, he not only discovered that Jupiter had moons around it, but he upended our concept of the paradigm of the geocentric universe in favor of a heliocentric universe, and substantiation via data and observations of what's called now the Copernican principle, which has been extended to something called the cosmological principle. The fact is that telescopes lead to data, which lead to rejection. Most people think that the job of a physicist is to prove a theory or prove that. You can't prove that the universe had a big bang. You cannot prove it. You can theorize about it. You can provide evidence for it. But at any moment, new evidence could come in that would supersede, contradict it, as has happened many times, the structure of scientific revolution. But my job is not to prove or disprove, but it is to provide evidence that then excludes the models of theorists like Eric Weinstein or Alan Guth, or if you like, any other cosmologist, or somebody who believes the universe didn't have a big bang. That's fine. And we're not going to suppress that freedom, right? So my job is to build with my students, postdocs, colleagues. Right now, the biggest cosmological project ever attempted of this type is called the Simons Observatory. It's located at 17,500 feet in the Atacama Desert in the Andes Mountains of northern Chile. And this is not only the highest astronomical observatory of its kind currently, it's actually the highest construction project on Earth. It's 3,500 feet above Everest Base Camp, where they have like a warming shack or something. So it's an amazing logistical triumph that my colleagues on the Simons Observatory, people at Princeton, Penn, colleagues here at UC San Diego, at Berkeley and Chicago, all around the world, 300 scientists ranging from undergraduates to gray hairs and beyond. We are building the most sensitive instrument, which will get first light to look back and look for the telltale signs of a singular inflationary origin of the universe, which, Peter, like what Galileo did, overthrew the biblical interpretation of a stationary central Earth. This could overthrow the notion of a singular universe, in that it could provide the first circumstantial evidence, but evidence nonetheless, of a multiverse.
God,
and so to me, it's the most exciting thing that we could
how incredible do. Like, how crazy cool. All right. I want to be respectful of your time, but real quick before we finish, tomorrow I'm speaking with Chris Rufo. I'm actually driving up. I'm back in the Pacific Northwest, talk to him. You can donate to my nonprofit, npa.org patreon.com/donate. Brian, where can people find you?
Well, I'd love it if people went to my YouTube channel. It's just Dr. Brian Keating, and Twitter, Dr. Brian Keating. But especially my newsletter, because that is the way I can directly communicate with people and not rely on the whims of the algorithms and so forth. So that is at briankeating.com. And there you can sign up for your chance to win a real 4.3 billion year old piece of space schmutz that hit the Earth thousands of years ago, and is evidence for the forging of elements inside the brilliantly luminous cores of stars, which would not have existed without the evolution of our universe from some earlier hot, dense state. Was it the original moment? Was it a time, Peter, before which there were no yesterdays? That's what we're trying to find out. So come along in the cosmic voyage at briankeating.com.
Awesome. Thanks. And congratulations on the success of your channel. I mean, only 0.3% of channels have more than 100,000, and you're
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. So thanks.
I got
thank
my
you
silver plaque in the back there.
All right. Yeah, I got one too. Yeah. So thank you so much for speaking with me. I genuinely appreciate it. I appreciate you taking the time to popularize science, which is one of the most important things that I think we can do, is make these ideas accessible to people and really explain in language that even I can understand some pretty cool concepts. So I really appreciate the work you're doing in the public realm. So thanks.
Peter. I said I have a non-sexual crush on your mind and everything you do. It's awesome. Thanks to your team. Thanks to Reed and Aaron and everybody over there at Boghossian Enterprises. That's a phenomenal thing, Peter. Congratulations to you.
Oh, thanks. And thanks, Reed. And thanks, everybody on my team, for doing this. Okay, Brian, stick around for a few minutes. All right. Thanks, everybody. And we'll catch you tomorrow with my conversation with Chris Roosevelt.